Although our commentator isn't yet here, I wanted to slowly but surely begin so that we can get to the questions, which I think are one of the most important parts of the evening. I'm John Czaplitska, a CS affiliate and cultural historian, and in the name of the Center for European Studies, we wanted to welcome our speakers, Professor Detlef Juncker, and our commentator, Dr. CATHRYN CLUVER, who's on her way, as far as I know. Also, I'd like to welcome Herr Generalkonsul Friedrich Löhr to this series, the beginning of a series of what we hope will be a series on German-American relations. This series relates to a project begun by Professor Felix Lutz and myself, which looks at the development in those bilateral relations during the last century. That's both the stand in the current relations and the history of those relations. We're very lucky to have Detlef Juncker as a first speaker in this series. This special CES event is also very much part of a series of events organized and supported by the German General Consulate to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the reunification of Germany. Well, I would say...
Time flies.
It does. 20th, I'm sorry. 20th, of course, 20th. I only missed 10 years. That's not bad on that statement. We want to heartily thank the General Consulate for the support, without which this event could not have taken place. And now I'd simply like to give the podium to Felix to do the introductions.
Well, we're doing this standing up because of technical reasons, not because every one of us wants to stand here in front of you. Well, I have the honor and the pleasure to welcome Professor Juncker from Heidelberg University and from the Heidelberg Center for American Studies, which he is the founding director, which he founded, basically. He studied history, political science, philosophy, and German philology at the universities of Kiel and Innsbruck from 1962 to 1967. Before that, he already worked as a newspaper journalist and editor. He got his PhD at University of Kiel in 1967 on Germany's Center Party. And after that, he was an assistant professor with Professor Eberhard Jäckel at the Department of History at University of Stuttgart. He spent a year or 2 years, I don't have the exact number here, I put it down wrong probably, as a postdoctoral research fellow at Yale University on a, pardon?
Not at Harvard.
At Yale, on a fellowship on a Max Kade, of the Max Kade Foundation. And he was a research fellow in Washington, D.C., a DRAD fellow in 1971. He wrote his Habilitation at the University of Stuttgart on the indivisible global market, economic interests in the foreign policy of the USA between 1933 and 1941. And he, using a multitude of previously unpublished sources, then the study examined the global economic crisis and the response of Franklin D. Roosevelt to this challenge. And as of 1975 until 1994, he was a professor of modern history at Heidelberg University. Then he was the director of the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C. from 1994 to 1999, where some of you might have met him. And from 1999 on, he was the Kurt Engelhorn Chair Professor for American History at Heidelberg University. And then your second career began, basically, as an institution builder, because that led finally to the founding of the Heidelberg Center for American Studies, which is the first private-public partnership in Germany in such an institution. I'm welcoming CATHRYN CLUVER, our commentator, but I'm not done yet with introducing Professor Juncker. He got an honorary doctorate from University of Maryland in 2005, and he got just recently the Bundesverdienstkreuz, which is called the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany in English. I could not have translated this. I looked it up. Professor Junker's work focus was on international history, on German-American relations, of course, American history of the 20th century, and some of his outstanding publications, I cannot quote them all, are his PhD thesis, Die Deutsche Zentrumspartei und Hitler, der unteilbare Weltmarkt, das ökonomische Interesse in der Außenpolitik der USA, 33 bis 41, Franklin D. Roosevelt, which came out in 1989, Macht und Vision, Präsident in Krisenzeiten. Then this huge 2-volume piece that I brought on German-American relations from 1945 to 1990. It's both published in English and in German. 130 you had to coordinate 130 people. I mean, that's heroic to do something like that. And in 2003, Power and Mission, Was Amerika antreibt. So I'm not going to talk about the Heidelberg Center for American Studies because I leave that up to you. I would make too many mistakes probably. It's a school, it's a think tank, it has a consulting capacity, and it's a cultural factor in the region, but you will explain a little bit more on that. The only thing that I have to say as a personal anecdote is he was basically the idea giver for this project, why we are here today, because when this book was produced in the late 90s, I think it was 1997, you asked me to write an article, a paper on transatlantic elites, transatlantic networks, German-American relations. And when I was going to work, do research for that paper, for the book, I found that there's nothing there, and so I finally had the idea, well, later on, a couple of years later, because this is 2010, the book came out in 2002?
This 2004.
2004, the German version, I think, in 2002. Led finally to this project on German-American affairs, decision makers, including the empirical part on German-American elites. So thanks a lot for being here today, and let me just spend some more time to introduce CATHRYN CLUVER. She is the executive director of the Future of Diplomacy project. Maybe you can say a word on that project shortly, which examines challenges to negotiation and statecraft in the 21st century at the Kennedy School. You worked as a producer and writer for CNN International in Atlanta and London, and for a number of public policy journals, and you served on the management team of the European Policy Center in Brussels, in Belgium, before working on public policy issues. And we were colleagues, though not at the same time, at Roland Berger Strategy Consultants. I was there from 2003 to 2005, and you worked as a journalist on branding and on public affairs and different other topics from 2005 to 2008. So, welcome. And now you're a fellow also at the Hauser Center for Nonprofit Organizations, but I assume your major work is with the Kennedy Center. Welcome. And thank you, and I give the word to Professor Junker.
Herr Generalkonsul, Dr. Shabjiwa, Dr. Lutz, thank you very much for inviting me over here and giving me the privilege to share some of my thoughts with you. I think Heidelberg Center for American Studies and Harvard Center for European Studies should make strong cross-breeding. I've been asked to say some words about the Heidelberg Center for American Studies. I can be brief. 3 miracles happened at Heidelberg. The first was I brought 6 faculties and 10 disciplines together and reinvented the notion of American studies. Normally, American studies is a mixture of culture, literature, history. And I wanted to integrate political science, religious studies, geography, and history on a broad scale. So you know what that means, given the inner dynamic of a university to bring these disciplines together. I like to say next to persuading my Dutch wife to marry me. This was the biggest diplomatic success in my life. The second miracle, I persuaded one billionaire and several millionaires, and by now I know that a billionaire is something different from a millionaire, to support our center on a massive scale. The billionaire bought an old palais, which is much older than our subject of studies, was mentioned for the first time in 1564, and he renovated it and gave it to us free of rent, which is of course marvelous. And that is the second miracle. And the third, I was appointed founding director. So I will be talking, as announced, on the widening Atlantic war gap, market gap, war gap, God gap. And I apologize for relying a little bit on my notes, because in spite of all these years in the United States, my relationship to the English language, I have to confess, is still a bit like my relationship to my wife. I do understand her, but I don't govern her. So permit me, please bear with me. I will begin my lecture with some personal remarks. Unfortunately, Herr Generalkonsul, today I will be the messenger of bad news. And I would like to remind you of the most basic tradition in diplomacy. Messengers should neither be beheaded nor shot, and I hope that I will be able to leave this room alive here. My somewhat gloomy message runs against my innate optimism. It also runs against my conviction that continued transatlantic cooperation remains vital to the cultural, economic, political, and not last but not least, security interests of both Europe and the United States, the sweeping global challenges since the end of the Cold War notwithstanding. On this message, I have to say, a contre-cœur, runs against my immense gratitude to the US and the American people as well. I owe the free and modestly comfortable life I had the privilege to live to a large extent to US foreign policy during the Second World War, during the Cold War, and during German unification. And besides, I happen to believe that the United States is the midwife of modern Europe. My lifelong affection toward the US started with an encounter in the summer of 1945. I was 6 years old. Though we belonged to the British zone of occupation, an American detachment passed through our small town north of Hamburg called Quickborn. And there he was, a huge, smiling African-American soldier who gave me what I had never experienced before, a slice of white bread with cheese and butter. It was a miracle. Since that miracle, I have spent almost 9 years in your country and toured 48 states, all of them except North Dakota and Alaska. I hope I don't offend anybody here. Like millions of others, I greeted the victory of the West in 1989-1990 with great expectations. The triumphal procession of freedom, private ownership, and capitalism, of liberty and property would march beyond Europe's and America's border into other parts of the world. A free Europe, so many hoped, would more effectively define and construct itself sui generis. This, later coupled with a shared currency, would enable Europe to engage more effectively in terms of foreign policy and would enable it to become a stronger, more equal support of the transatlantic bridge. That were the hopes 20 years ago. Of course, as you all know, the world and the West have changed in different directions. To my mind, there are several centrifugal forces that endanger the cohesion of the West. The first is the loss of a shared enemy, the loss of anti-communism and the Soviet threat as a military raison d'etre of the Transatlantic Pact. As a historian, I know the dissolution of alliances following a shared victory is a basic pattern of history. The second centrifugal force arises from the one immutable fact. America regards itself as a world power with vital interest on all continents and seas. America's European allies are at best middling powers whose core security interests are Eurocentric rather than global. And the third centrifugal force arises from the often divergent politics and responses of Europe and the United States to the enormous power shifts and crises of an increasingly multipolar world. Today, however, I will not focus my attention on these problems, but rather on structural differences between the US and Europe. This might lead to the conclusion that the transatlantic reactions to the challenges and crises of today are influenced by the different political systems and values of the US and Europe rather than by the reality of the new geopolitical and geoeconomic situation in the world. I would therefore like to present a brief sketch on three major differences between the old and the new world, as I see it: the market gap, the war gap, and gold gap. Now I'm suffering from a water gap. I need some water here. I will begin with the market gap. With the most severe financial and economic crisis since the Great Depression, the proper relationship between state and market has again become the subject of fierce dispute and intense public discussion on both sides of the Atlantic. One fundamental question is back at the forefront: what is expected of the government and what is expected of the market? Swings in dominance between state and market go back for centuries. The industrialization of the Western world in the 19th century was characterized by a dominant market sector, epitomized by the laissez-faire Manchester system, and a small government sector. In the decades following World War I and the Great Depression, and then during and after the Second World War, the state gradually took over. Western governments, as you all know, assumed growing roles after the Great Depression and then during after World War II. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal was the first massive intervention of the US federal government in the economic life of the American people, of the common man, as FDR would like to say. The Great Depression was proof that the self-sufficiency of the market had broken down. The belief in planning, regulation, and redistribution by government as a way to promote a stronger economy and protect its citizens against the most basic hazards of life, hunger, unemployment, sickness, and old age misery, became widespread. In the end, the so-called mixed economies were established on both sides of the Atlantic, based on an ever-changing, ever-contested relationship between the state and the market. In spite of this general trend, however, before the current crisis, I took a transatlantic market gap for granted. The division of labor between market and government could be clearly seen in the total government expenditure as part of the GDP. Although the ratio of government expenditure to GDP has increased greatly in all Western nations, remarkable transatlantic differences have remained until today. In 2008, government expenditure in relation to the national GDP totaled 38.6% in the US, 43.4% in Germany, 45.4% in Great Britain, 51.2% in Sweden, and 51.5% in Sarkozy's France. These are all numbers from OECD statistics. At first, these numbers seem astonishing because the American government spends as much money as most European states in several fields: in social investment, like the healthcare system, and in future-oriented fields like education and research. As for security and military, I will talk about this later, the US invests a significantly higher part of its GDP than the core countries of European Union. The difference with Europe lies in social politics. Europe is the region of the world that has the most extensive social welfare system that is financed chiefly through a mixture of private savings and public money, that means the taxpayers' money. American social welfare expenditures add up only to 50 to 60% of the social welfare expenditures of the leading European welfare states. I have experienced this quite often. Even the most market radical American who has lived in Germany for an exceeded period is happy to be able to use the German social and healthcare system in times of need. The longer they live in Europe and in Germany, the more they tend to agree to a basic thrust of 2 new books published this year praising the American and the European economic model. Stephen Hill's Europe's Promise, Why the European Way is the Best Hope in an Insecure Age, and Thomas Georgigan's Were You, the Americans, Born on the Wrong Continent, ? How the European Model Can Help You Get a Life. On the other hand, a few years ago, I had the traumatic experience of being admitted to an emergency room in Washington, D.C. with pneumonia. Next time, I will follow the advice of an affluent friend. The moment you enter an emergency hospital in the US, pay $5,000 up front to the so-called hospital guide who will take care of you. Before the outbreak of the current crisis, political scientists and economists had good reasons to distinguish between 2 competing types of economic organizations or varieties of capitalism in the transatlantic world. The market economy model prevalent in the United States and the social market economy, not the socialist, the social market economy that is present in much of continental Europe and is called Rhineland capitalism. And then, after September 2008, the whole world seemed to turn upside down. As the old truism goes, capitalism without bankruptcy is like Christianity without hell. This truism seemed not to be operative any longer in the United States. If you listen to modern theologians, hell is no longer what it used to be, and banks in the United States, if they are big enough, are not allowed to fail anymore. As President Obama explained in his inaugural address, the question we ask today is not whether our government is too big or too small, but whether it works, whether it helps families find jobs at a decent wage, care they can afford, and retirement that is dignified. To prevent the US capitalist market economy, indeed the global economy, from sliding into the abyss of another Great Depression, the US government, its organizations, departments, and agencies intervened massively into the business cycle. Congress, the Federal Reserve Bank, the Department of the Treasury, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Department of Justice. Since you have been bombarded with all aspects of these interventions since September 2008, I just want to mention 2 examples. The US national government made about $13 trillion in guarantees and commitment to the US financial sector. That is, I think, the biggest emergency welfare operation of all time in US history. But it did not go to the poor, the welfare, but it went to the finance industry. And second, the accumulated national debt stands around, I think, 13 trillion, and it's growing, times where you can see it every day. The Fed, as you know, administers massive injections of liquidity into the system, which was thereby put on artificial life support. And though the Fed bought 1.7 trillion in mortgage-backed securities seem to be an oxymoron, I would say, and government bond last year, early this year, to prop up the economy, the Fed again, several days ago, decided to flood the market with cash in the amount of 600 billion, presumably to stave off deflation and to jumpstart the American economy, thereby antagonizing most of the rest of the world. Ironically enough, in the age of globalization, the nation states, that is a taxpayer, turned out to be the actors of last resort, trying to enforce transparency, stricter capital requirements, limitations on leverage, better control of investment banks, hedge funds, private equity institutions, and especially on derivatives, the so-called financial weapons of mass destruction, the ticking time bomb of modern capitalism. So the big question now, in the context of my argument, is, will this increased power and scope of government agencies become a more permanent feature of the American political system? Will the transatlantic market gap be narrowed? Of course, as you know, as a professional historian, I only have the power of hindsight. My educated guess, however, is no. Why? A strange alliance of the Republican Party, Wall Street, and Main Street, as represented by the Tea Party movements, is mobilizing the American public against big government. Indeed, while we cannot know the ramifications of last week's election until January, we begin to see the effect of this mobilization in the direction it may take. Additionally, as you know, the Robert Course has sent strong signals as to how it views the relationship between government and marketplace. In spite of the massive failure of economics and of risk management in the financial sector, there is still in the United States a deeply felt belief in the old Jeffersonian wisdom that the government is best which governs least. The passionate fight about the proper relationship between the state and the market is again dividing the American people. And this debate doesn't take place in Europe. Last but not least, if I may add, President Obama is no FDR. The analogy of the second New Deal is misleading. FDR, the country squire from Hyde Park, attacked Wall Street head-on, regulated and transformed the US banking system. Listen to what Roosevelt had to say in his first inaugural address. I quote Roosevelt. The money changers have fled from the high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truth. The measure of restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values more noble than mere monetary profit. Or listen what he had told the Democratic Convention as he ran for office in 1936. I quote FDR. It was natural and perhaps human that the privileged princes of the new economic dynasties, thirsting for power, reached out for control over government itself. They created a new despotism and wrapped it in the robes of legal sanction. In its service, new mercenaries sought to regiment the people, their labor, and their property. That was FDR. FDR articulated nothing else than the European vision of a social market economy. That's what it was. On the other side, Obama's answer to the massive failure of big finance was to use a skill that he had learned as community organizer and street worker in Chicago's broken black communities. Adopt the role of a mediator and listen to all sides before you make a decision. So instead of throwing the money changers out of the temple, he made him his financial advisors. There's not the slightest proof that he ever wanted to change the American economic system. Accusing him of socialism, Marxism, even National Socialism is just insane. Obama helped saving capitalism and lost the midterms. Watching the recent election campaign in many European countries, there is bewilderment, lack of understanding about the anti-government furor of the grassroots uprising in this country and the almost religious zeal to fight big government in Washington, at least rhetorically. To sum up, even after the big current crisis, the relationship between this government and the marketplace in the US might again resemble the relationship between the famous lady from Riga and the tiger she was trying to ride. Let me quote this old limerick. There once was a lady from Riga who smiled as she rode on the tiger. The tiger came back with the lady inside and a smile on the lips of the tiger. That may happen to the United States. Now, this was the longest part. Now I turn to the war gap. A colleague of mine from Stanford, James J. Sheehan, recently published a highly commendable book entitled "Where Have All the Soldiers Gone?" Where have all the soldiers gone? The transformation of modern Europe. Sheehan revisits the theme, which another historian, Robert Kagan, made headlines a few years ago. Kagan argued, as you know, that the bellicose United States are from Mars and the passive Europe is from Venus. The theme of both books is the demilitarization of the European mind and the European societies. Sheehan reminds us that in World War I, on a single day in August 1914, 27,000 French soldiers died. On July 1st, 1916, 20,000 British soldiers died. And in the battles for Verdun in 1916, at the end of 10 months, there were 320,000 German casualties and 379,000 French casualties. Today, European nations have to make the greatest effort just to summon a few thousand soldiers for an operation in Afghanistan. Soldiers, by the way, who are well equipped, allowed to fight and willing to die. Allowed to fight and willing to die. When President Obama threw his weight behind General McChrystal's so-called new strategy, he plainly expected Europe to commit at least 10,000 more troops, plus equipment, trainers, and money. Yet Europe sent barely 7,000 troops, and 1,000 of them came from non-NATO members. Today, 100,000 American troops are stationed, several thousand from Great Britain, France, and Germany, and even Great Britain is about to take these soldiers back. Sheehan's findings are correct. Europeans are living in a demilitarized and post-heroic age. They've sacrificed the lives of too many soldiers and civilians in 2 world wars. After 1945, they lived too long under the specter of a nuclear holocaust, if deterrence failed, to believe in military solutions and the legitimacy of war unless directly attacked. The European experience with war, defeat, humiliation, devastation, occupation, and collaboration is something few Americans outside of the Confederate States of the South have ever experienced. For the first time in 2 millennia, the likelihood of an intra-European war is almost zero. After German unification in 1990, the Germans could say for the first time since the founding of the German nation-state in 1871, we are surrounded by friends only. It's a completely new situation in European history. And because of this basic transformation of Europe, the attempts of US foreign policy to reignite Europe's martial spirit are, in my opinion, doomed to fail. The pacification of Europe is quite likely to prove irreversible in the near future. The conversion of NATO from a defense alliance to an instrument of global power projection under American hegemony is a pipe dream, from my perspective. Even US Secretary of State Defense Robert Gates will not reverse the trend of the last century. In a remarkable speech at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., in February this year, he attacked the Europeans, and I quote, "One of the triumphs of the last century was the pacification of Europe after ages of ruinous warfare. But I believe we have reached an inflection point where much of the continent has gone too far in the other direction. The demilitarization of Europe, where large swaths of the general public and political class are averse to military force and the risks that go with it, has gone a remarkable sentence, from a blessing in the 20th century to an impediment to achieving real security and lasting peace in the 21st century." 3 years ago, I had the privilege to listen to the American Deputy Chief of Staff in the Pentagon propose that all German soldiers in Afghanistan be placed under unified American command. I asked him, "Are you aware that your proposal would mean a political kiss of death for all elected members of the German parliament, the Bundestag?" Of course, he was not. Yesterday, there was an editorial in the New York Times, and the topic was the new cooperation between France and Great Britain as far as aircraft is concerned and nuclear policy. They say, that is nonsense. If you need an aircraft carrier, you can get it from us, and you better send a lot of soldiers to Afghanistan. This reflected an ignorance about Europe, New York Times. It's just amazing. The American-European war gap means that with regard to one of the most existential questions of humankind, the legitimacy and necessity of war, there exists a vital difference within the transatlantic West. And this war gap is not only visible in the political culture, but also in military expenditure and the ability to lead a war. According to estimates, the US is responsible for almost 50% of all military expenditures worldwide. The US Senate this April signed the biggest war and defense budget in the history of US, $636 billion. Most likely, the Obama administration will have to ask for additional $30 billion soon. In 2000, the war and defense budget was not even half as large, about $300 billion. All things considered, the US has spent almost $1 trillion on the two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which, if I may have this value judgment, which in my perspective were doomed to fail from the very beginning, and I've been saying this since 2003. The US maintains the biggest military machine of all time, on land, on water, in the air, in the space. With a destructive power, US armed forces could pulverize any point on Earth within 20 minutes. And next to the visible empire is an invisible empire of mushrooming secret services. That's where there is a suggestion to change the American national motto. In God we trust, all others we monitor. In God we trust, all others we monitor. In God we trust, all others we monitor. This leads me to my last gap, the God gap. Individuals or nations, in the process of defining their own identities, seem to have a hard time tolerating the idea of being merely equals of others. They attempt to arrogate to themselves some special significance that is supposed to render them different from and superior to other individuals or nations, indeed to make them unique. In the process, they frequently invoke notions of exalted generality, such as God, history, providence, progress, or the salvation of mankind, all capitalized, of course. Like the citizens of so many other nations before them, Americans too claim to be a chosen people. The idea of America's special mission has been a self-evident aspect of its political culture since the founding of the nation. The founding fathers, as you all know, were shaped by the spirit of the Enlightenment, but they integrated the Christian missionary ideas of New England's settlers, the chosen people, the covenant people, God's new Israel, and God's last American Israel, into the idea of a secular mission for America. And it was this fusion of Christianity and Enlightenment that brought forth the civil religions specific to America. That unmistakable mixture of Christian republicanism and democratic faith that created a nation, as has been said, with the soul of a church. And God is an integral part of a civil relation that connects almost all Americans. It is a national religion from which they derive a large part of their identity and sense of destiny, especially the idea of a universal mission of freedom. And this civil religion is at the center, I would like to say, of the American Trinity of God, country, and freedom. American Trinity, God, country, and freedom. During the Bush years in particular, Europeans learned a lot about the relationship between religion and politics in the US. The almost universal criticism of President Bush derived also from the fact that the predominantly secular Europeans were simply unable to understand the worldview and the belief system of this president twice reborn. only very few Europeans knew that this president was the latest incarnation of Wilsonian universalism and of America's missionary impulse. They were baffled when President Bush told the American people and the world in his 2003 State of the Union address, I quote, "The liberty we praise is not America's gift to the world, it is God's gift to humanity." For more than 2,000 years, European soil has been the resting place of victims of missionary empires, from the Roman Empire to the racist mission of National Socialism. Today, in post-heroic Europe, there's not one missionary nation left. As far as politics is concerned, God is absent, except perhaps in Poland. God has become a deus absconditus. To conclude, or in conclusion, I would like to pose a question. Can we, with all the differences in the transatlantic relationship, speak of the West as such? Is there something of political substance that binds the transatlantic world, that holds it together? Just because we can see intense transatlantic communication in virtually every aspect of our lives does not mean that we are saying anything. Because of the electronic revolution, anyone can communicate with anyone else in any part of the world. In my opinion, the glue that binds the transatlantic world and constitutes the West is the bequest of the Enlightenment, the bequest of the Enlightenment. That's the very essence of the West. And this bequest consists of constitutionally enshrined freedoms and individual rights, the dignity of the individual, the rule of law, and the separation of powers, the thorough separation of church and state. And this bequest is liberalism and democracy, constitutionalism and federalism. In this respect, I would say the transatlantic world is different from the trans-Pacific world. And among these most basic rights are free speech, a free press, and freedom of inquiry in research and science, for example. We may thank the Enlightenment for the fact that public opinion on both sides of the Atlantic can discuss the future of the transatlantic community freely and openly. And we are free to agree that we disagree. One of the most important political and cultural achievements in world history. Thank you. It has been my honor to speak to you and share my thoughts with you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So in full disclosure, I should say a few things. Oh, sorry.
You can.
Oh, absolutely. I can. My pleasure. No, that's fine.
Yes, but it works fine
Does
because you
it?
told
Oh,
us that
fantastic.
we
Oh, great.
shouldn't interact.
No,
Okay.
he would like to. Is it for you? Okay.
It's fine, it's
Okay.
fine.
Okay. Thank you.
Good. It's more it's more convivial
Okay,
this
okay.
way.
It was the technical aspect of this one.
Okay, good. So in full disclosure, I should say that I am not only a transatlanticist in study, but I am a transatlanticist in my very nature. Because the first time that I was exposed to American culture was at my birth, because I am the product of an American mother and a German father that met in Hamburg, so not far from Quickborn, indeed. And so my life has been completely dictated in a very fortunate way and has awarded me every possibility by my binationality. And not only by my binationality, but by the nature of my two passports. So in full disclosure, I am the biggest fan of the dual passport regulation you will find anywhere, because I have used it to pay my taxes in both countries. I have used it to exercise my citizenship rights in both countries. And I have thus, I think, been able to live a very global and globalized life. And so then to reflect on these issues is very much always in my mind as this sort of bifurcated being in some ways, but then also in my professional role thinking about what the future of diplomacy is and what the future of peaceful conflict resolution, not only across the transatlantic, of course, but in a more globalized sense. What is the role and what do established players have in terms of a role, in terms of looking at different ways of addressing global challenges? And we heard so eloquently how large they truly are and how deep they go into our very core, into our very values, into our very understanding of one another. And if the fundamental relationship across the Atlantic is not strong, then you wonder whether whether abandonment issues on either side are true, should be taken seriously. The president, of course, is in India and is in Indonesia, and he canceled his attendance at the EU-US summit, which is a continuation in some respects of a tradition that was started by George W. Bush when he also declined to, when he reduced the 2 transatlantic EU-US summits from 2 to 1. That was an American initiative. And left other initiatives like the transatlantic business dialogue and sort of things that function extremely well, as you mentioned, across the Atlantic without, in some respects, us even being aware. So I wanted to talk, you talked about the divisions so eloquently, and I wanted to talk about a few things in those 3 areas that unite us and that pose challenges on both the transatlantic axis but also on a global level. You talked very much about you set your talk up in looking at the relationship between government and the market regulation. And I found it fascinating to read, and I'm sure many of you did as well, Nicholas Kristof's latest piece on the banana republic within the United States, which sort of, in the piece he looks at, and I'll read just off a couple of numbers, how the wealth gap in the United States, despite the economic crisis, has been astounding. And so I would put forth the thesis that in terms of regulation and in terms of the role of the government in this country going forth, it will be a lot about mitigating inequality. And it will be a lot about looking at how you can pass the wealth that is generated in certain parts of the market economy down to the neediest to stem long-term unemployment, which is, of course, beginning to rear its ugly head across the country. So he says in the statistics that he cites that CEOs are now making 42 times as much as the average worker in 1980. And then he goes on to say that from 1980 to 2005, more than 4/5 of the total increase in American wealth went to the richest 1% in the nation. So that while there is no way that I see that we can change the American creed to be more that of the European, more of the redistributive, and you mentioned I was particularly interested in this sort of the Nordic, the Scandinavian numbers on public spending. But increasingly, I think, and that is, of course, a major concern now of the Obama administration, how do you redistribute wealth? How do you structurally make changes within your employment sector, within your labor sector? How do you deal with, and this is going to become, of course, if Obama has the chance to have the second term he so desires, how does that trickle down to things like immigration policy that links directly into the idea of the United States as an incredibly open country, a melting pot of cultures that brings forth the kind of innovation that has kept it at the forefront of innovation, particularly in science and technology. But I also thought about, in that context, about how in Europe, traditionally, when people have demanded change and increased involvement of their government in these crises, we're witnessing across the board a greater willingness of people to voice their dissatisfaction on the street. So very clearly, the rise of the Tea Party and the vehemence to which it has made itself known for all of its potentially misguided ideas is that there is clearly a desire for something in between the two-party system, something that gives voice to fears that are, and this goes back to the values point, universal, that arise in globalization. So the sort of demonstrations that we have seen even now on the streets of Germany, whether it's focused on the protests in Stuttgart or whether it's about the rise in pension ages in France, there is a universal fear that is manifest and as a result of globalization. And beyond the role that governments and markets play together is how does the political elite address those very basic human anxieties that bind us across the globe, irrespective of what side we're on. And the American creed is particularly interesting in that respect because there is this mentality of wanting to do it on your own and wanting to resolve your problems on your own. And yet, you take to the streets, and yet you try to form a third party that, if you look at all the failed third-party movements that we've had throughout the history of the United States, actually puts people both in the Senate and the House. So that's a very interesting how human fear in the face of globalization and real concern, even in mixed messages, can, in an established system, create such change. And we can talk about whether or not that sort of development, that need for a different form of democratic expression is something that we can benefit from, or whether that's something that actually endangers traditional government structures. On the war effort, my boss is the former Undersecretary of State, Nicholas Burns. And to work so closely with somebody who was such a figure within the Bush administration and had such insight into foreign policy decision-making, particularly in this very difficult phase for the U.S. administration, is an incredibly enriching experience to me. And often we sit and debate, me on the one side explaining the difficulty that we have as 27 member states, some of which are opted into the military option, others who are opted out, some of who are within NATO, some of whom are not, the kind of choices that we have to face. And at the same time, he sort of comes back to me and says, yes, but if they were keeping up their side of the bargain. So I would propose on that issue, would I want to see increased German military presence? I'm a daughter of a father who was born in the middle of the war. I remember very clearly the stories of my parents, my aunts and uncles, of being bombed out of their family home, of my grandmother walking for 20 kilometers for 2 potatoes. I'm still close enough to what German history means and what it means, and I was very much, as a student activist, protesting the First Iraq War in my hometown. So these things have left me, sort of these issues have left me very conflicted. At the same time, in part because of budgetary cuts and in part of structural issues in the military, on the sort of military realm in Germany, we've seen new efforts in terms of trying to figure out what the German military of the future should look like. If we aren't deploying massive force, if we aren't deploying to major areas of fighting, then what are we contributing that's innovative in the sense of problem solving? We had the Danish Minister of Defense in just last week, and she brought in Legos to explain the Danish strategy in Afghanistan. Why did she bring in Legos? Well, she didn't bring in blocks, wooden blocks that you could have held together, because her point was to talk about the integration of the civilian and the military arm of rebuilding in Afghanistan. She brought in Legos. Why? Because there's those little suction cups on the Legos that have to make it fit neatly together so that civilian and military efforts in deployment can function seamlessly. And you can say what you will about the size of the American military budget. Within the United States Army, you have the Army Corps of Engineers. You have programs like the Human Terrain System, which deploys social scientists into the field to better understand the needs of the population on the ground. If we are to be taken seriously, us Europeans, and I say this in the widest sense of the word, even looking at sort of how we're trying to pool heavy arms and sort of streamline, even within the European Union, the Rapid Reaction Force, we need to come up with more innovative, with more relevant measures that respond to the challenges that we face in the Hindu Kush, and areas that very much, and it was very interesting to hear the Danish defense minister talk about liberty and how she sells the Danish war effort based on liberty, and how she has her Danish soldiers come back and speak to the population about their experience in the field. Now, we don't do this in Germany because our narrative is a very different one. But I wonder if there were two things. If we can think about changing and reframing the narrative of our engagement abroad and define different, innovative, more flexible solutions, whether they are in peace building, whether they are in capacity building across the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, whether there is a way that we can, again, as Europeans, and I think the Danes are a good example for this, underline our relevance in global conflict resolution. And then finally on the God gap, I very much enjoyed the survey that was published in German newspapers just a few months ago that highlighted that while Americans are very much the church-going population that they like to put themselves out to be, they have a limited understanding of their own faith. And of course, the most famous now Tea Party Senate candidate who was honestly surprised that there was a separation of church and state in the American Constitution. I think the biggest concern there, to me, and I think what I find is most difficult to explain to Europeans, is the impact that religion has on specific organizations that lobby policy, that raise money for policy. So I think particularly in what happened in Colorado, in pockets of Colorado during the Bush administration, the way that a religious belief around abstinence and around the traditional family raised through a number of organizations a lot of money in campaign funding for the Republican Party. That those sort of linkages in terms of how then there is, despite the fact that there is a separation of church and state, that still very much reaches then up into the highest echelons of American policy making and the way that elections are shaped and won and narratives are shaped and won. I think my final thought in thinking about the transatlantic relationship is always one of story, in a way, is one of narrative. Because the way that at the Prague speech, the Europeans were at Obama's feet because he articulated that he alone could not solve many of the problems, but that he was in using nuclear nonproliferation as an example, giving back the possibility of action, giving back the possibility of joint goal setting and ownership in a political process was something that Europeans hadn't heard from their own politicians in years, I would argue almost decades. And this idea that there is a role for the public in shaping the political environment is something that clearly, and again you see this in the demonstrations on the street, that there seems to be a greater thirst for. And in order to reinvigorate the transatlantic relationship, I think we need to give it a new narrative, a narrative that moves beyond the peace that was at the foundation, or the need for peace that was at the foundation of the European coal and steel community, things that are still meaningful to my generation, but will not be as meaningful to the generation that comes after me and my children. And so I think as we sort of move beyond these things, move beyond these divisions, we need to find a new narrative that tells a story of why the relevance is there and why this is the most relevant relationship, not the relationship with the BRIC countries, but the foundation of global peace and answers to very complicated global challenges.
So I'm going to, well, first, Would you like to reply at all to that?
Should I? But we can open the meeting, but they have
Okay, and I'll open it to questions. then.
with Q&A. Let's start with
I
Q&A.
thought your discussion of the evolution of political thinking in Europe in the last 50 years was quite useful, particularly noting that Europe had been through a long series of war from the First Reich to the Third Reich. You also noted differences between America and Europe. I would remind you that the United States was brought into two European wars started by Europeans. And the United States is skeptical about the wisdom of European leadership. I think there's some reason for it historically. Now, you pointed out that in the last 50 years, Europe has recognized the value of peaceful solutions. Some incidences, Pol Pot killed 2 million people. About 500,000 Chinese were annihilated in Indonesia. We had the war in Botswana. There was a killing of some 2 million people about 10 years
Have
ago.
a
in Central
question
Africa.
though, please?
I'm trying to, okay. The point is, I'm not sure human nature has changed as much as the idea of not having to have military power, as you seem to be suggesting. Furthermore, the Europeans right now are having a tremendous problem with the Islamic population that they don't seem to be handling all that well. So I have a suspicion that the 50-year gap in a more military or a more robust security stance may have occurred in a rather unusual time in history. And the assumption of what you're talking about is that human behavior has really radically changed. I hope you're right, but if it's possible that in 15 or 20 years from now, things that are going on right now will begin to become much more aggressive in terms of Europe's interest. And so I don't know what the answer is, but I think that there's a certain smugness about the Europeans. I'll conclude on a point. Gerhard Schroeder, when he ran for chancellor the second time around, really lambasted the Americans. We now just had a speech.
So what is your question?
My question is Europe really sure it's got the right answer in terms of the decisions you're taking today? Are there possibly consequences which in the longer term are going to be seriously problematic for Europe itself?
Now, I'm from Heidelberg, and Heidelberg is Max Weber territory. And that means that you start your talk with a basic distinction between what is and what ought to be. You see, I was trying to speak, my intention was not America bashing, my intention was to give some descriptive explanatory sentences. And your reaction is what I very often discovered in American discussion. If you're trying to just to explain the fact we might discuss about it, you immediately feel a little bit offended. You see, this was just a phenomenological description. And a completely different thing is what we ought to do in the future. Now, I have never argued that there is there is a better European model than the American, but I was stating a fact, and these facts, you see, I hear here saying like a lot of these people who are in the security business, they think it can change a narrative. You cannot change a narrative. You cannot. Well, I think you can change the narrative, but that doesn't change anything as far as the feeling of the publisher is concerned. Just try another PR trick. That is not doing it. So what I say, there is a basic structural divergence which has to do with the 21st century. The other thing, which is completely different, argue whether, given the world as it is, we should rather follow the more robust or bellicose way of the US or the other way of Europe. That is, you see what I mean. The other thing is, of course, you mentioned Schroeder. Even if there had not been these tradition or development of a European mind, they wouldn't have gone to war to Iraq, because almost all thought it was nonsense from the very beginning. You cannot fight Al-Qaeda with massive troops. It was always universal consensus. And of course the German government wanted to do something. The authorization of the German troops doesn't mention the word war. The German troops are not authorized to fight a war there because for legal problems. And what is our Secretary of Defense then saying? So in colloquial terms, Alltags, we might talk about war. So there are basic elements, developments, structures, ideologies which you cannot change at whim. So I would stick to these, to my proposition, to my analysis that there is a massive war gap. The other thing is we could then change the discussion what ought to be done in the future. But we don't go anywhere if we don't stick to the decision of is and ought. It's a very fundamental epistemological problem we have here. Yeah.
Okay, first, and then Steve.
I've got a question. Do you believe that maybe many problems between Europe and the US also originate in different ways of speaking? I mean, I've come about this problem just recently because I was working in my office and somebody came by and we talked a little bit, and then he said in the end, well, I like Europe. I just don't want to live in socialism. So I was, as a German, you die in that moment. But then then someone said something really smart recently that if an American says, I don't want to live in socialism, that kind of like means our social democratic system. But for us, socialism is something different. And in many speeches in the US, you can always realize that there's a totally different usage of language as in Europe. Is that maybe even a problem for many of the gaps we have?
Yeah. Now, the other is the word liberal. You see, liberal is if you go back to the original Latin, liber means frei, and all the founding fathers of the United Nations were liberals. But since New Deal has been a completely different notion as a left-wing interventionism. That makes no sense at all. If ever I teach German students, first of all, liberal means a completely different thing than in German and Europe. And so, of course, socialist. Now, we are a social market economy. You think the competitive German economy is socialist? It's nonsense. But it is a deep-seated fear that once you concede that the government should be responsible for distribution, regulation, and even set a ceiling to the basic needs of life, then all of a sudden most Americans we end up in socialism. And the difference between the social market economy or the social market capitalism and socialism is very often not understood. And I think here, as the Center of European Study, you would have the obligation to say it again and again and again, as I try to explain at Heidelberg what liberalism means. And then, of course, another aspect, there are unspoken assumptions, a heritage which you are carrying with you, and you take that for self-evident or granted. And at some point, you have to start thinking about your unspoken assumptions. And so, you see, I'm a hopeless child of the Enlightenment.
Steve?
Yeah.
It's a very complex and troubled subject. First of all, to this question over here, I don't think we can discount the fact that the Federal Republic has lived in peace internally and externally for more than 60 years. You speak as if there's some sort of eminence in the psyche of this land or this other country. That doesn't accord well with social science knowledge, let alone the history of Germany since 1949. Well, now, regarding these gaps, I was much more pleased with your description of the market than the other two gaps. And I like the discussion of the market gap because there you contextualize the problem, and you noted that there's a different view of the state in the USA and in Germany, and you might even go a step farther, would you? And say there's a different view of self-reliance, quote marks, in the USA and Germany. And that's a nice contextualizing of that gap. when you came to the war gap and the God gap, you noted the gaps, but you didn't contextualize, and at least not to the same extent as you did with the
Now this is
market.
35 minutes.
Okay, you know. And instead, after noting the gaps, well, secondly, I didn't particularly like your conclusion, namely that we are all, on both sides of the Atlantic, influenced by the Enlightenment. Well, yes, but the gaps remain, the differences remain. The dual-track decision in the 70s, the middle-range missiles disagreement, the fact that in Germany there's a Green Party, these differences are still there. So there's something more going on than a common Enlightenment heritage. There are further differences there that cannot be accounted for by reference simply to the Enlightenment heritage. And I think if you, on the one hand, brought back, or rather, let's put it this way, brought the three gaps together, noted how the God gap influences the market gap.
Yes.
And how the war gap is influenced by the God gap.
I agree with you.
Connecting them,
Yeah, I agree with you.
interweaving them, then we have a portrait of really a lot of solid differences, and your capacity to contextualize, having lived here so long and seen how different the frame of mind is in a way, is a message that needs to get back to Germany. I hear time and again that the Americans, in rejecting health care, or at least most parts of the Republican Party, are completely nonsensical, completely ignorant, that's not an explanation. You need to contextualize it in reference to, yes, self-reliance, view of state, etc.
Yeah.
And that was my problem with your, I'll stop it, with your discussion of the war gap. You said the New York Times was ignorant of Europe. Well, that may be the case, but that's not the point. The point is ideology took over knowledge at that point in that editorial. And why did ideology take over? Because there's a God gap, and because there's a war gap and a market gap. I think these gaps are significant, and we need to explore them in their complete depth, and then get that message across on both sides of the Atlantic.
Now, I'm glad that you conceded, that's not little, that these gaps exist. And I completely agree with you that they are interrelated. Now, what can you do in 35 minutes? You have to focus 1, 2, 3, and then for example, one of the most interesting questions for me is, to what extent this market fundamentalism is based on a religious experience that these centers came into this country hating the dictatorial state, and they wanted to get the state out of the mind. And if ever you drink the absolute like water, that's what the market radicals are doing. That's Schlegel, to drink the absolute like water. Then, according to my experience, there's almost a religious element involved. And I think there is a link between the God gap and the market gap. You can phrase it the other way. In the United States, you have more than 1,000 denominations competing on a marketplace for the soul and purposes of the believers. And and some economists say that is typical supply side economics. Supply side. And the difference is not that basically the European psyche is less rich than the American. The difference is the supply side. You're bombarded with offers here. And I can give you a lot of experience when I travel the United States. Just stick to one. My wife and I, we toured Florida, and there was a church billboard saying, sermons on Sunday, free ride to heaven. So you need that is something. Or in Salt Lake City, 16-year-old proselytizing young woman, and this old historian, I started to laugh. She said, go into this room, there are computers, and you get answered all your questions. I pushed the button, I'm not making this up. And the question was, where did Jesus Christ go after resurrection? I always wanted to know this. The answer, in the year 34 to North America. So, in the year 34 to North America, so you have this supply-side religion. That's a marketplace. It's a marketplace. And we will have an international conference, and the question will be, if that is correct, how does this market-oriented religion affect the structure of the churches, affect the structure of theology? You mentioned that. And political. 50%, did you mention that? 50% of the American Protestants, according to don't know who Martin Luther was. 55% of the Catholics had no idea what Holy Communion means. So the UM say that the religion in the United States is a mile broad but 1 inch deep. It's about experience. If you go to
knowledge if you have religion.
yeah, that is, yeah, of course. Tell that to my professor of theology at Heidelberg.
No, but you're trying to understand America on its own terms.
Yeah,
at
I
some
do.
point.
Yeah, yes,
And that's what I'm talking about. You don't need knowledge to understand that those people are overriding through belief
Yeah.
all of what you think is important, the knowledge of Luther, the knowledge of the community. That's not important to a true believer.
Yeah, and that's,
Derivation historically is not important. to a
yeah,
true
I know.
believer.
I agree with you. I agree with you. Yeah, and that's the difference.
Yes, it is.
That's a difference. But what I meant to say, there is an intimate connection between the marketplace and religion. That's one of these interconnections.
And the US has the marketplace
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Europe does not.
Yeah, no. You have the marketplace, and your churches are all filled up. We have the official churches, and they're all empty. Please go ahead.
Okay. Is there other- go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, Council. Yeah. Yes, please.
I just try to sort of practice a happy steal from my Washington ambassador's insights, who are of course broader and deeper than mine because he covers the whole of the transatlantic relationship, and I wish to say that transatlantic relations have probably never ever been as good as they are today, or hardly ever been as good as they are today, despite all these gaps. Just take a few examples. Take the regulation of the banking sector, which I'm quoting again my ambassador, who said, well, he said that the ultimate form of admiration is of flattery is copying something.
Yeah, yeah.
And this was one.
Imitation is the best part of flattery.
Thank you.
Flattery.
In Afghanistan, the cooperation between Germany and American troops works very well, despite linguistics about how close or far.
Are they winning?
Beg your pardon?
Are they winning?
But that is
They were Berkshire. Are they winning?
But that is a problem we share on both sides
Yeah.
of the Atlantic.
It's a cooperation between entities which are kept separate within
Yeah.
Afghanistan.
Yeah.
I mean, there are two. We're talking about two armies that cooperate, but in very separate ways. There's no central command in a certain way, because they're kept out of the conflicts in the south, of course. I mean, there's also. Sorry, Mike.
Go ahead.
And about the God gap, I mean, I'm sometimes tempted to think that the only practical transatlantic problem we may have sometimes is political correctness, namely how to address the God gap properly in this country. You know. Otherwise, even that doesn't really matter. I'd like to leave it at that. I say more, but.
Sir, I have the great privilege to disagree with you. Of course, you are a diplomat, and you have always have to have this upbeat idea. Otherwise, you would drive yourself out of bed. I understand that completely. But Afghanistan, there are two separate armies, and the American military doesn't like it. They have tried again and again to establish a unified command. Would be impossible because there's no authorization, and because the vast majority of Germans disagree about German armies being there. They simply disagree. They tolerate it to some extent unless you talk openly and unless the sacrifices are limited, but there is no substantial support of the German soldiers in Afghanistan. There is not. According to public opinion poll, 60 or 70% are against them. So what I mean is, you may act with your general diplomatic niceties and try to things, but on the fundamental level, there is a difference. There is a difference. And it matters, because why is the German government not able to change the situation? Because they will lose, they have no mandate from the Bundestag. We have a parliamentary army, by the way. And to your point, we have now 680,000, will be reduced to 165. Draft will be abandoned. So do you think that is more of a contribution to NATO? No. And then we have the next problem, I would say. Even with 280,000, you can bring to the front line at maximum 15 to 20,000 soldiers. That is, to some extent, it's a welfare army. Huge bureaucracy. We do have as many generals as we had 1990. And they have all, it is amazing what is going on. And so, and this is being supported by the German public, because the Germans care more about the garrisons at the local level because they bring money than to fight Afghanistan.
Can I?
Yeah?
Yeah, no, I mean, that sort of the idea of military reform, I think, is fascinating, because if you're going to cut down conscription,
Yeah.
then you have to actually, it's very interesting, because the Germans will have to look in some respects at the American model, because how do you make the German army an attractive workplace?
No,
Right?
the Germans
How
don't
do
want to
you-
have these.
Well, but I mean, look, these are considerations. These are considerations. Right? Okay, but it's there's some things that you may or may not want from a value standpoint. However, there are situations that dictate a response, right? And so whether it's you're tightening fiscal pockets,
Okay.
or whether it's changing global conflict. So this idea is, the way that Germans have, and I mean, look, I'm in many ways completely supportive of the way, the Americans would say that the Germans or the Europeans, if you want to widen it, are skirting their responsibilities.
Yeah, yeah,
and the
that's
traditional
true.
German
Yeah,
way,
yeah,
the CATHRYN and others have argued, is this idea that we get out the checkbook and then we pay for the next operation, or we hide out in the relatively, pacified South and relative pacified North, and we try to send as many police officers to EUPOL as we can, and then nobody wants to go because, goodness, isn't that an unattractive place to work, right? So then you have to come up very quickly. Either you have to, and that's what I was getting to with New Narrative, either it's this idea of you start telling the story of your engagement through the eyes of your soldiers and the work that they're doing in civilian capacity building, and the kind of good work that fits with the German norms and the German values and the German narrative, and you get the actors to tell that story, right? And I think there is a bit of that in the Ministry of Defense that's already going on, and that would influence the way that you set up how you think about the reform of particularly the German Defense Force, because if you're going to cut down so drastically, you have to make it smarter, you have to make it more mobile, you have to make it relevant to NATO, and you have to make it an attractive workplace. I mean, you look at the Bundeswehr ads, and I mean, that would be the last place in the world I would want to work, right? But no, I mean, I'm being quite serious. This is where, and this is why I think this is where, in terms of a gap, the Europeans really have missed something, despite the fact that we've had the Rapid Reaction Force since the late 90s. We've tried to come up with very innovative ways, the German, French battalions, we've come up with very innovative ways of bringing our military together, but we haven't come up, both on the civilian and in parts on the diplomatic side, with innovative ways of dealing with new challenges. And we can't leave that arena to the Americans, because then we will make ourselves irrelevant.
First Felix,
Yeah, Felix.
and then Claudia, and then
Well, three very short remarks. First of all, I have to agree with Generalkonsul Löhr. Within this project, I've been doing 50 qualitative interviews with German-American decision makers, and most of them say German-American relations on the working level, at least, have never been as good. Germany is not on the radar of the Americans just because they cooperate so well. Even since the time during the Bush administration, though it was not public then. There had to be dissent. Second remark about God, as a neuroscientist and concerning the God gap, there's a very interesting explanation. You know, neuroscientists say God, religion, is just a cognitive structure in our brain that came from the need to cooperate in the older times. Now, when you look at the American social system, you need to cooperate, you need to fight alone. That's maybe why you need God much more here on this side of the Atlantic than in Europe. Third remark, Professor Juncker, German foreign policy and military policy and whatever since 1949 was a top-down process. The German elite never cared what the German public wanted. The EU was expanded, and most of the German people were against it. They were against Poland, they were against Hungary, they were against the extension to the Baltic states, and later on they agreed to everything. So there is some ambivalence to that. Now, two questions to both of you. I hear a lot from your questions, sir, and also from a New York Times article recently written by Nicholas Coolish, who wrote about the new German pride and the fun the Germans have showing their flag and singing their national anthem. And you can even buy now the national anthem as a Klingelton, as a ringtone to your phone on the T-Online homepage, which is the Bild-Zeitung, which is yellow press, something unimaginable before. Now, but this New York Times article said, celebrating the Germans having fun and what a great country and all that. And in the same article it said, it asked, now will the Germans leave behind this big project they call Europe? So this whole article changed immediately with this one tiny little sentence. Is there a lot of distrust because we don't know enough about each other?
He left it?
Pardon?
I wanted to know what you meant by that, this sentence changed.
He wrote it. He asked, well, the Germans have fun, but will they leave Europe behind?
What's the connection?
National pride.
There's no connection.
Well, there is no connection, but it's just it's in the New York Times, and it's the most read paper on the East Coast in New York.
It's poor journalism.
Okay. Is there distrust or isn't there? And is it based on knowledge or is it based on prejudices and cliches? First question. Second question, and when I look at German foreign policy makers, for example, in the Verteidigungsausschuss, I don't see any transatlanticists. I see no knowledge about the US at all, except for maybe one or two reserve officers. Second, the narrative you were talking about. The German narrative is the Holocaust. We are leaving behind this narrative. We said, now when you talk about a professional army, you're leaving behind the learnings from the Holocaust that were our taboo zones until 1989, 1990. We are taking apart the narrative. We used the narrative to go into Yugoslavia, to take part in that war, in our first war, but we are changing it dramatically. And we still have some very restricted rules of engagement in Afghanistan that nobody knows about, that still go back to that, but we're changing the narrative. The American narrative is liberty based on God. It's not God, it's liberty based on God. But they're giving up this narrative. When you talk to American middle-class people here, they are entangled in tax fights with the IRS more than the Germans are. The Patriot Act is taking more freedoms, allowing the state much more in looking into people's privacy than any German government ever could. So are Americans, I say, the question is, are both narratives changing due to facts?
Would you like to stop as Europe? Or should I?
Or both narratives. So I mean, I think the European. So this is always a problem that I have with my American friends, right? So what is the European narrative, right? And then so as I think things become more complex, I have a tendency to split it off because I start with the meta European narrative, and then I find myself sort of saying, I think particularly of the millennial generation and sort of the narrative that we have to tell, because to me, that was the point I was trying to make about my own personal history. These things, and even thinking about the modernization of the German army, these are things that can very much inform a modernization and innovation within sort of the practical arms of foreign policy. I don't think you were sort of alleging that there was a break there. I don't think there needs to be a break there. You need to come up with a better way of
Is there a
no,
break?
but I think there's a way that you can make that actionable. You can make that fundamental value that derives from German history, without whom, I wouldn't be who I am. I mean, that's very much how I was brought up in that tradition. That is the narrative in my family. We have oral history of my grandparents in World War I and World War II. That's how my family operates. The question is that how families operate in the future, right? And this is where I sort of get to, what does the European narrative mean? Is it enough of a story that things are going well, right? So then we have a Kulisch op-ed that has to end with that, because it has to be provocative. And it sort of has to allege that the centrifugal forces that you were talking about, right? Whether it's Germany's, desire to return to the D-Mark, or its desire to, put the flags out of the windows for important sporting events. But there is a narrative that's changing. If you look at the football team, if you look at the last names of our football players, there is a fundamental change within the society, within the demography of the country. And for me, and I think this is true in French societies in general, or in European societies in general, also in France, the way we're deluding ourselves on the debates that we should be having, on the really, truly difficult debates that we should be having, because it's the kind of debates that are, in some respects, have started with the Obama presidency. And I think that was where the hunger for Obama that you could see in Europe was there, this idea of who do we want to be and what do we want to do as a people, as a population, as countries. And I think that was a debate that was started here and then insufficiently answered, and particularly, maybe it's still very much part of the process, or people wanted answers too quickly, but certainly the financial crisis veered that off track. But this idea of the fact that we're discussing what is multiculturalism in Germany today is a debate that we could have had 20, 25, 30, 40 years ago, and we didn't. And we're these sort of fundamental debates about who we are, what we want to be, and how that needs to play forth in the sort of policies, in our foreign policy, in our defense policy, are discussions that need to be had much more actively and much more provocatively, because I find it hard to convince people now who are, again, a generation or two younger than I am, that just because it's good is enough to make it great.
May I say one or two words about Europe and Germany? Europe has been and still is an open-ended vision. There are now 27 members. Others would like to join it. And it's open-ended in the sense that nobody knows whether at some point we will have or should have a United States of Europe, or whether Europe should be a cooperation of nation states. So, and the second notion, the prevalent one. There are some Euro admirers say that's not enough, but that is an open-ended problem. And this problem is very much manifested in the ruling of our Supreme Court. They made two decisions, 2 times, saying, okay, the ultimate sovereignty rests not with Europe, but with the German people. And then the Maastricht Treaty, all the problem came. The second is, if the ultimate sovereignty rests with the German people, the very essence of sovereignty, one essence, is the power of the purse. So, Merkel is now trying to delude a problem she might be having when she was very instrumental in promoting help to Greek and this fund. There are a lot of lawyers in saying that is extra legal. You cannot give away the power of the purse of the German parliament and just decide, okay, I will guarantee this billions. That is one problem. And then the second is, of course, all institutions in time of crisis come under stress. And the current financial crisis puts additional stress on the European Union, partly because, especially in Germany, they fear that Germany in the end has to pay the bill, and we are responsible, or we have to pay the bill for these BRIC states. For Greeks, we found out that the Greek people had never paid any taxes, these kinds of things. So there are tensions. On the other hand, until now, nobody declared to leave Europe in spite of all these problems. So, and even more would like to come into these things. And the other thing is, without the euro, the financial crisis might have destroyed Europe and all the individual currencies. The euro was a protection and still is one. Of course, they are under stress. The next problem may be Ireland, then Portugal, and when they're under this stress, the European Union will stay together. It's open question. I think yes, but it is difficult. And so Chancellor Merkel is in the forefront of demanding fiscal disciplines of all states and terminate the guarantee to the financial banks. And she's extremely upset about the new decision of the American Fed because they are now pouring more money. And they think, here the Americans are back, beggar my neighbor policy, it's our currency and your problem. We have done that since 1972 several times. So there's another additional stress. And then it's amazing, free market society, Geithner officer wants a worldwide regulation how many surplus you're allowed to have, irrespective of whether your government is competitive. Now what is that a non-American idea? Runs counter to Doha and all these things, but that he's demanding. And the rest of Europe is, of course, Merkel says, you better get your economy straight, more efficiency, then let us compete on the world market. So that is another tension inbuilt. And there you have this strange situation that Geithner would like to have a worldwide regulation and regulation how much you have to import and export. That of course runs counter to the very idea of free trade. The very backbone of American creed.
Could I suggest you read Mark?
Could I, we have people that want to ask questions.
Okay.
Claudia and this gentleman, 2 short questions, please.
I've got more
then
a comment than a question, but I'd really appreciate your reaction to that. My comment is deeply personal because and it's related to the war gap regarding Afghanistan. I tried to contribute for a year on the ground to the nation building there.
Yeah. Oh, did you?
And I believe what is at least as dangerous for the bilateral relation between Germany and America is very dangerous for Afghanistan itself. And that is what I perceive as a blind spot in the public debate about the problem of that country. The German public seems to have a blind spot regarding the war that is necessary, as Obama rightly put it. But the American public seems to have a blind spot when it comes to the nation building, which is equally necessary. And I think that the stress that the German government is putting on that nation building is much more than an excuse. And I'm pretty proud of my own chancellor and the speech that she gave just before the Afghanistan conference in London in January of this year, where she resisted the pressure to name a definitive date of pulling the troops out, which is a very, very dangerous thing to do, and that I regret that Obama thought that he had to do it. So the nation building is extremely important. It takes a lot of time and a lot of support. That support, of course, I would also hope to materialize more for the German army, because they are ill-equipped,
Of course.
and they need more and more support. And the reforms that are being talked about, I think, are instrumental in keeping them or making them better prepared for missions like this.
Last question.
Question to the experts. What exactly does the war gap consist of? Is the support of Afghanistan or Iraq in the American population indeed so much bigger than in Germany, as far as percentage of the population or the voters are concerned? Is it a difference in the readiness, willingness of a government, the administration, independent of the population, to use force for whatever reason is deemed necessary out of global mission, going back to the God gap? And that would bring me back to Europe and its aversion to war. Did Europe fight war for the fun of the population? Was it supported in the populations in the 19th century? I remember. I remember Bismarck's remark on the Balkans justifying one Pomeranian grenadier. So would Europe react differently if there were an issue at stake that is fundamentally challenging Europe's existence or vital interests? For example, when we look at future resource issues. So what would be your view on the differentiation of the war gap?
Now, as far as Germany is concerned, first of all, I agree. Once you send troops over there, you have to equip them adequately. And you need money for that. But you see, to get the authorization from the German Bundestag for more money is extremely difficult, because the vast majority think it is useless, and it is useless to try nation building there. These are feudal societies, these are kinship societies. The very idea to establish something like a Western style or democracy, or even a functioning state, has never been a functioning. West tribes competed with each other. So there is the majority of the Germans don't think that it is feasible and advisable. And as a story, you have the law. So that there is a massive disagreement, or the majority they simply don't buy that. And when they hear, so see, if the staggering $1 trillion for Iraq and Iran, and Iraq, you will have a civil war. You have a civil war endlessly. You will have Iranian intervention. The place will be less safe, even more dangerous than before. So the very idea that somehow you can bring peace to this with military intervention is most unlikely. Most unlikely. So that is, you see, but once you do it, I agree with you, then you have to adequately equip your soldiers. We haven't done that. Because the very being is not supported by the vast majority of the German population. A different thing would be, there's one future element of cooperation, that would be a new nuclear missile shield, because that would bring existential problem to Germany back. We are living under the nuclear problem for 50 years. And I say that is the aspect, and Rasmussen wanted to make that one of the most important points in NATO. That could be an aspect of cooperation. That could be aspect of cooperation. The problem is you have to bring Russia in. That's another problem. So, I'm sorry.
Catherine, you just want to make some
Yeah, I
comments?
just wanted to wrap up on that. I mean, I think you basically summarized my argument perfectly and more candidly than I probably could have, because of your firsthand experience in the country. Because I think that's vitally that's vitally important. And I don't, again, it goes back to this point that it exactly fits with what the German values should be, right? It's about, if you're going to reshape, if you have the unique opportunity to reshape an army, then do it right. Then equip it for the challenges. And that's why I felt that Lego analogy of, it gets back to a basic idea of, should soldiers, or what is the soldier, quote unquote, of the future? Is he part civilian aid worker? Is he part camp builder? Is he part school constructor? Is he, the personification of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, right? So these are questions that are in this phase that we're in are absolutely vital to be answered, right? Is there a smarter way of doing our defense that's even long range, without long-range missiles, if you will, right? So still with that human infrastructure. So I think there's a way of doing it, and I really truly hope that they get it right, because I think then that makes a very clear argument for our relevance and for the relevance of transatlantic cooperation, right? And then you can tell a story. Then you can have the German soldiers tell that story in a way, I would argue, that would alter the public perception of how, German liberty is a word that I would never put in one sentence in that context. But this idea of, whether it is about protecting vital interests, which is the integral security, right? It's preventing terrorist acts on German territory, on European territory, whether, they're sent in the mail from Greek or wherever. Yes, exactly. Through Greek ports, right? Because ideally the European system works and shuts that off completely, so they should never arrive in chancelleries elsewhere. But if that's the story you're telling, then you can let the actors tell that story, and I think that would be a lot more compelling than to do it in a top-down fashion. And I think that public opinion, just to finish off on that, I think is fascinating, because I think you'd be hard-pressed around the midterm elections to even know whether Afghanistan or Iraq still figure in the forefront of the American mind, right? Because despite the fact that you have Bob Woodward's book on Obama's wars come out 3 weeks before the midterm elections, and a very clear linkage made by Stephen Walt and others that essentially Obama foreign policy with respect to these two wars is a continuation almost directly of a first and second term Bush administration. It doesn't, in the grand scheme of things, cause any kind of a kerfuffle, because the American mind, and that's what I meant earlier with the fear aspect, is so ratcheted up to the personal at this point. And then the Tea Party can make, it's really, it comes down to the personal. And that's what I meant in terms of the power of the individual narrative. If you don't tell the story so that it's functional for the individual, you're not going to get that pushback, and you're not getting it right now.
I'll leave one last remark.
Obama got the Peace Nobel Prize. Remember that. And what did he do in his speech? He justified the idea of a just war. Nobody ever got the Peace Nobel Prize, ever done that. And the European, I myself was confused. On that occasion, the essence of his speech was to justify just war. And of course the Hitler analogy came in. That's always the argument of last resort in international relations. So it is amazing. It is amazing. And then I discovered at that point that I agree with you, that he wasn't that far away from Bush.
Woodward's book basically makes that clear.
So think about Obama and the Peace Nobel Prize.
Okay, I wanted to thank our speaker, Detlef Juncker, and our commentator, CATHRYN CLUVER, for coming tonight. And thank you very much. And then invite everyone to the reception upstairs that follows us directly.